It is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Susan McDaniel. She is the Prentice Researcher in Global Population and Economy, Director of the Prentice Institute, and Professor of Sociology at the University of Lethbridge. Her research contributions are on life course, demographic aging, generational relations, family change, and the social impact of technology. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the recipient of many research and teaching awards. She has held prestigious academic positions. She has served on the National Statistics Council for 15 years, advising the federal government of Canada on the collection and analysis of all public data, and she serves on the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Canadian Council of Academies. Please welcome to Susan McDaniel.
Thank you very much, Raquel, and thank you all for staying for the last talk of the day, but of course there are cocktails to reward you, so maybe that's the reason. Let me just start by saying very quickly that I thank the organizers for inviting me to this splendid conference, which thus far is excellent and really very well organized, so I appreciate that. And for the kind introduction, of course. I just want to mention, to start with, that the A in the middle of my name is not any kind of affectation. It's that there's another Susan McDaniel, and this one could answer some of the questions that were asked about procrastinating, because she's the president of the American Psychological Association. I'm not a psychologist, but she could answer about procrastination, so I'm the one with the A in the middle, that's why. Okay. Let me just say, on this paper, there are 3 co-authors, none of whom could be here, so I'm stuck with the questions, but this is a 4-authored paper. In terms of acknowledgements, I won't go through them all, but this research is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and data analyses were conducted in the RDC, which is part of the Canadian Research Data Networks, and the views in the paper do not express the views of the CRDCN. But I also want to thank, for the qualitative part of this, because it's multi-method, a brief qualitative part at the end, thank our respondents for sharing their experience and views, and our research assistants who interviewed for the qualitative part of this analysis. Brief overview. Lower income, as we know and as we've heard throughout this conference so far, is well known to be associated with poorer health over life course. But the potential influence of perceived financial stress on life course well-being trajectories has been less well explored. There are some intriguing findings which motivates us to do this paper. Cross-sectional research, for example, suggests that older people reporting financial stress independent of low or high income or subjective financial worries have worse health outcomes over their life courses. Longitudinal relationships, however, over specific life courses following individuals of perceived financial stress on physical and mental health from midlife to the later years has not been well examined. There are 3 studies which I'm going to mention, none of the 3 in Canada, and taking a slightly different perspective than we have, are the only 3 that I know who have done this. The longitudinal relationship, particularly over the life course of those in different birth cohorts, also calls for closer study. And we're looking primarily at the pre-boomers and the boomers. So I'll just leave it there without defining what that is, because most of us have a pretty good idea. So I want to emphasize that our focus in this study is on perceived financial stress, regardless of socioeconomic level. So we're going to control for socioeconomic level and look at the effects of perceived financial stress. And this poor little guy really symbolizes the kind of stress that someone can feel. The background, of course, and just very briefly, low income, well-known association with poorer health. The Whitehall study is the exemplar of this. Each time you go up a rung, health improves. We go down a rung, health deteriorates. Even with universal health care, as we have in Canada, universal access for needed health care, even then, low income socioeconomic status makes a difference, and it may be even more the case with aging than it is throughout the general population. There should be a policy interest, a potential policy interest in reducing income disparities, and we know how that works with social assistance, with pensions, as we've heard, at various points in the life course, other means to prop people up when they're in low income, and we know that that has had a good effect on average for older adults. In fact, Canada is recognized as having a success story in this, something of which we should be proud. But ameliorating low income of older adults to enhance later life well-being, although a key tenet of the Canadian policy process since the World War II, has been successful. There may be other factors that we need to look at. So our research questions are 4. How is perceived financial stress or financial health associated with physical and mental well-being at midlife as individuals age into their older adult years? How do changes over time in perceived financial health affect late life well-being? What relationship exists between financial health and well-being that people anticipate in their later years? And this gets to some of the earlier papers that we've talked about, the future self, the current self, that kind of issue. And do the effects of perceived financial health over time vary by individual characteristics and differ for those in midlife? In other words, the pre-boomers versus the boomers. So previous research, and I'm not going to dwell on the authors here, so if your name should be on the list and isn't, please forgive me. I'm just giving an example of what has been done. Cross-sectional research, not a lot, but cross-sectional research has found negative effects of perceived financial stress on well-being, independent of income. The relation of low socioeconomic status and perceived financial stress on well-being has been found to be independent, which is also very interesting. Longitudinal studies of the relationship of socioeconomic status to well-being, very well known. A lot of work done on this. There are very few longitudinal surveys of the relationship of perceived financial stress to well-being over time. And these are the 3 studies we know about. There may be more, but these are 3 we're focused on. One is by Wilkinson. This is Lindsay Wilkinson in Texas, not the Wilkinson of health inequalities, a different Wilkinson. And she found, looking at the health and retirement study, about which we've heard a bit today, that financial strain has a strong and robust predictor of worsening mental health with age. She does a longitudinal study. A study in the Netherlands by Dijkstra Kirsten et al. Finds, with respect to depression and anxiety, that there's an association between perceived financial stress and anxiety disorders over a 4-year period only, but it is longitudinal, irrespective of income level. And lastly, there's a Taiwan study, Chiao et al. At Taiwan, the Taiwan Longitudinal Survey finds that older adults with perceived financial strain had significantly poorer well-being. So this is all very intriguing, and our interest perked up in 3 ways, and I'm going to just mention this to set the stage. By Angela Orant, who argued, she was part of this project, incidentally, in the beginning, and had to drop out because she took on administrative duties at Duke University. She argues that cumulative advantage is not the opposite of cumulative disadvantage, which I find immensely intriguing. I've talked with her at length about this. And it seems to be related to our 3rd point here, so I'll go through that in 1 minute. By Ferraro et al. In 2009, that one's sense of status can only be understood by perception of relative disadvantage, which is very different than whether you actually have low income or high income. It's where you stand in the pecking order, in other words. And then a study, a theoretical, conceptual perspective that I developed with my late colleague, Paul Bernard, from this university. And we distinguish between gravity and shocks as you go through the life course. We also talk about other things. But with respect to gravity and shocks, we're talking about shocks in a slightly different way than was talked about earlier. We're talking about shocks that can be systemic shocks, or they can be individual shocks, or both together. So gravity would be the pull of disadvantage, which can occur at birth if you're born into a poor family. It can occur later on if you're disabled or something happens to you, or your situation somehow changes dramatically. Gravity pulls you down. But a shock can occur to anyone at any time. And it can be a very quick shock that affects your income, your prospects, your sense of your future self, or it can be a systemic shock that seems to affect everyone, but usually not equally. And this is where Oran's comment and her insight about the cumulative advantage is not the opposite of cumulative disadvantage. So if you have cumulative disadvantage, you're moving through your life course and you get a shock, you're in a different situation if you have cumulative advantage and you get a shock. But your perception of it might be similar or might be different. The reality effects could be profoundly different. So this is what intrigued us, or as people say here, what the motivation of the study is. We in demography tend to not use that language, so it's kind of fun to hear. So perceived financial stress possibly could be one pathway through which low income leads to poorer health outcomes. So it's not only low income, it could be that that's a pathway. It may be one way of sorting out gravity effects from shock effects, and of course the interaction of the two. If shock effects, which can happen in any socioeconomic status, are found to matter, policy implications might be significant. In other words, you're not just pushing people up a little bit in low income, but you might have to insulate a tiny bit against shocks that can occur to anyone. So because it's late in the day, I thought I would just add a tiny bit of humor. Not sure if I need an emergency fund or if I can get by whatever change is trapped in my couch. Our contribution is, well, of course, this is a bit arrogant, but we try to say, how are we going to position ourselves in the literature? One way is specific focus on Canada. So far as we know, this hasn't been done. We look simultaneously on cumulative inequality plus shocks. So we're looking at two things. We're trying to sort out the objective financial well-being from perception, and we're comparing two cohorts, the pre-boomers and the boomers. And we do add this multi-method component, an in-depth qualitative component. And why we do this is quite interesting, and it's also quite fun. The existing data, and many people have complained about the numbers we get. They can't tell us this, the categories are wrong, they change, they don't match. Whatever quantitative data we use, even if it walks on water and does everything we want it to do, it's always, always out of date, because it has to be cleaned and stretched and manipulated, or you have to get permission to use it, and it takes time. So what we wanted to do was to get an in-depth, so we can look into people's lives and their experiences and their views in depth, but we also wanted to get a moment in time which was contemporary. So that's why we did some quantitative interviews. We did the qualitative. We did these in the US and Canada, but that's another paper. This one is focused on Canada. I'm going to talk about that. And we explore briefly some possible implications for policy. So the framing, quite simple but intricate. Social determinants of health broadened to include this perception. Welfare state theory, of course, because the shocks can come, they can be systemic. Life course perspective, gravity, and shocks. Longitudinal analyses on well-being from midlife to the later years, and a multi-method approach. So what are our data? Our data for this study primarily, but not exclusively, are from the Canadian National Population Health Survey, and we have longitudinal data from 2001 to 2010-11. Now, it's important to know, of course, and I know you all know this because it's been mentioned multiple times, that covers the time of the Great Recession. And the Great Recession, which started in 2008, was not as hard on Canadians as it was on people in other parts of the world, notably Americans, but it still did hit Canadians hard. But it hit them differentially depending on where they were in their life course and where they were in terms of gravity. Respondents we chose were 45 and above in the first cycle. Well, not the first cycle, cycle 4, the first cycle we looked at. And were followed longitudinally over 6 cycles over a 10-year period in 2 cohorts. So we have a fairly sizable sample. In terms of, what have I done? Oh, why is this not? Oh, there it is. Pushing the wrong button, sorry. In terms of statistical analysis, we depend on 2 dependent variables. They're not perfect, but nonetheless, that's what we were relying on. Self-reported fair or poor health, and again, the distinction is fair or poor. We're not making small nuanced distinctions. And self-reported high psychological distress, which is the K6 distress scale for mental health. And again, it's an interval measure, which we scaled. Okay, statistical analysis for this part of the analysis is multi-method, mixed effects, logistic regression. I won't go through all this. The key predictive variable I want to mention particularly, it's the Financial Problem Stress Index, which was derived by Stats Canada through the statement, you don't have enough money to buy the things you need. Now, this can be interpreted on 2 levels. One is you don't have enough money in reality. You don't have money. At the same time, what you need, as we all know, because Santa Claus is coming soon, has very little to do with what you consume. We don't buy necessarily, a new faucet and new underwear for Christmas because we desperately need them. Need is a very, very flexible concept. So if I say I don't have enough money to buy the things I need, it would be profoundly different than somebody who is a single support mother living on a very low income. So I think this concept of need is perceptual and filtered through a whole variety of things about what constitutes enough money. The kinds of things people say, for example, in the business pages about how much money you need to retire, none of us would ever retire because we would never be multimillionaires, and that's what we say we have to have. So the way in which we perceive need and the way in which it's filtered through to us is a very interesting kind of a phenomenon. So we have models, we have 4 models, which are sequentially adjusted multivariate models for the 2 cohorts, 45 to 64 at the beginning in 2000, and then 65 plus later, 65 later life. So we have these 2 cohorts, and we've adjusted them for various factors, particularly in models where we start looking at all of the usual culprits: education, employment status, marital status, age, all of this kind of thing. And Model 4 adds to Model 3 the interaction term between time and the financial problems stress index. So what kinds of findings have we got? The first thing I want to talk about briefly is the mean levels, simply just what they are, not in terms of any models. The mean levels of self-reported health, which are on the left, and psychological distress, which is on the right, for across the 6 cycles. And what you see is quite interesting. The yellow bar, where are we here? I'm sorry, the bar with the eggs, with the ovals. I just saw the ova, the Cirque du Soleil ova, so I think of these as eggs, is age 65 plus, and that's at the top here on the left. And you see that overall, people who are 65 and above have worse health for every cycle. It's not a huge surprise. Some people by the end of this, who are 65 and above in the beginning, are getting older and older, and their health gets worse, and the line climbs up. Gee, I'm negative at the end of the day. Sorry about that. And then the age 45 to 64 also have increasing on average poor health. What happens when you look at the psychological distress? You see the opposite pattern. So in other words, the people who are age 65 and above, with the exception of 2008, 2009 significantly, have worse psychological health, and the people who are 45 to 64 have better psychological health, but both took a leap during the Great Recession, which is not a heck of a big surprise. So what are the multi-level odds ratios for self-reported poor health. This is physical health. What we see here, the table shows multi-level logistic regression predicting poor or fair self-rated health. And we're reporting adjusted odds ratios for the variables of interest. And essentially, in a nutshell, what you find is that for the people, the boomers, you find that there's a significant increase in increased chance of reporting poor health with Model 4, which is the one that adjusts for the interaction term between time and financial problems. The same is true for the pre-boomers here as well, but it's less of a jump. So this already is a very interesting kind of a phenomenon. In terms of this graph here, trajectories of self-reported fair or poor health by financial stress, it essentially replicates what we would see in the odds ratio. So let's move along here. Multi-level odds ratio for self-reported high psychological distress, we see the same kind of pattern, that when we control for everything pretty well and we add in time. Incidentally, these are averages for individuals, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But what we've done is follow individuals over time and then average them for these tables. So it is individual longitudinal analysis. You see the same thing, the effect of financial problems, the stress index increases, makes the odds ratio jump, essentially, for people in midlife. And this is very interesting because these people are presumed to be kind of at their peak. As we see what happens when they are aging, they have a very different likelihood of succumbing to financial problem stress than their peers who were older when the study started. So I think this is something coming down the pike that we might have to be quite attentive to. And the trajectories are, again, similar. What we see, again, is this bump in 2008, 2009, which is the kind of shock that we're talking about, that these people can be marching through life and suddenly experience a systemic shock that affects their psychological well-being based on financial stress. So does the effect of perceived financial stress differ among individuals? Well, here we add a random slope for financial problem stress index. The significant variance random effect estimate addresses the research question, the effect of perceived financial stress and whether it varies by individuals. And what we find is that that this index, the random slope coefficient, does remain significantly different from zero in each model. It indicates that our controlled variables, both constant and time varying, cannot explain all of the interdifferences in perceived financial stress in physical and mental health. So this is all very interesting, I think. In terms of the qualitative analysis, let me just run through this because we found some really exciting things. We found particularly exciting things compared with Americans, but that, again, is a separate study. And we did in-depth interviews with two classes of people in the United States and in Canada, but I'm not going to talk about the United States, living in two comparable cities. Now, we're keeping the cities anonymous, but they're comparable in terms of ethnic distribution, size, amenities, that kind of thing. And the interviews were conducted at 2 points in time, just when the Great Recession was beginning, which has got to be one of the only advantages of the Great Recession, is being in the field when this was happening, to ask the questions. You know, what do you think's happening? What do you think's going to happen? Fascinating. The predictions were not what you would think. A lot of people were quite convinced this was going to be a small perturbation, no problem, we're going to be fine. Didn't quite work out that way. And then we interviewed them again in 2013. So the focus here is only on the Canadians aged 46 to 63 in 2013. So what were some of the findings? Financial precariousness, whether current or anticipated, is a recurrent theme. So these people were worried at both times, both in 2008, 2010, and in 2013, about financial precariousness. Now, what does this mean? That means they lack confidence in their current situation, their jobs, but they're also worried about that future self. More than 1/3 in 2013 reported lacking confidence in their financial situation in old age, regardless of their socioeconomic status. They're worried about this. They're worried about how it's going to work. More than 1/2 expected their financial situation to change for the worse when they retire. And this was particularly true, interestingly enough, for middle-class respondents, who expect their financial prospects to be worse and express perceived financial stress as they go forward. But there are other things that come into this. Well, let me just share with you a quote, because this really puts a human face on it. Things might be a lot harder if they don't fix the economy. It's like everything is blown up. Housing costs are ridiculous. I don't understand how people afford new houses. Food is way more expensive than it used to be. Anxiety comes out. And this is true for middle-class people. Anxiety's coming out. Working and middle-class Canadians are noticeably concerned about their children's financial future. And this is rather like what's found in epigenetics, where trauma from one generation somehow goes to the next. It's very interesting research that if people who've never experienced the trauma of residential schools, for example, or the Holocaust, feel the trauma. They carry the trauma in their body because somehow they've been exposed to this intergenerationally. Well, this is sort of similar, where working class and middle class Canadians are noticeably concerned about their children's financial future. And this was mentioned in the earlier responses as well, but it only increased in the responses in 2013. My daughter, we're quoting here directly, my daughter, she lives here rent-free. We help her with school. We have helped her in the past with educational costs. I don't mind, they're my children. We don't mind, but hopefully she'll find a job. This is the phenomenon of what we sometimes call cellar dwellers. You know, the kids that live in the basement till they're 42 because they can't find a job. It'll be harder now that we only have one main income, but we're not going to deprive him, the child, the adult child, of the medication he needs. Her son has an eye problem and requires expensive treatments. Now remember, this is Canada, so what is medically necessary in hospitals and doctors' visits is covered usually. But if you need expensive pharmaceuticals outside of hospital, sometimes those are not covered, and probably in this case, that's what was going on. So people are out of pocket for that kind of expense if they don't have employer insurance. So respondents see financial precariousness related to psychological distress, and they say it right out loud. My parents passing away in the past year. I don't have anyone to care for me. This is scary. I don't have family anymore. Working class, this was a working class respondent. We cleverly coded them WC. Here's another working class respondent. I guess it would be harder for me because I don't have family and depend on my friends. In fact, I'm single. I don't have anyone to depend on except my friends. I guess I wonder if something does happen to me, who can I depend on if my friends couldn't be there? Now that I'm thinking about that, it's an important consideration. You can just see the psychological anxiety rising. So in terms of discussion and conclusion, so we will have time for questions, and I'm within the time frame here. In both cohorts, respondents increasingly report worse health and higher psychological distress as they grow older. There's not a huge surprise there, although it is a little surprising that the stress is less for the older cohort than it is for the younger one, the pre-boomers. We find a strong association between subjective financial stress and self-reported overall health and psychological distress in both cohorts, independent of income. Those reporting financial stress have worse subjective health over their life courses, and the effect of financial stress on physical and mental health is greater in midlife than for those in later life. Now, there's no real clear interpretation of this, but one possible interpretation of that is, and I'm not sure whether it's right, so I'm out on a limb, but that the pre-boomer cohort grew up in a they grew up during the Second World War, and then some of them were old enough to experience some of the Great Depression. And plus that, they had a lot of insulating welfare state policies that they depended on. Housing was cheaper, for example, but they also could depend on pensions that they didn't really pay much into, but they got benefits from. So I'm not saying that they were spoiled in any way. I'm just saying that it was a different life course trajectory than for the boomers, who have to compete with everything for everything. And the boomers are a huge group, so they're highly diverse, stretched out in terms of diversity. So there might be something going on there, but it's an interesting finding, I think. So investigations, continuing discussion, investigations of the effect of SES, socioeconomic status, on health should include, we argue, based on this evidence and the evidence from Taiwan, the US, and I forget what the third one was, but whatever, Netherlands, sorry, should possibly include measures of perceived financial stress, which is an additional nuance or a meaning that could be added to socioeconomic status. Income alone does not capture the difficulty individuals and families experience in trying to meet their needs, whether their needs are realistic or not, or whether they're based on relative status compared to others that they see around them. So interview findings echo quantitative findings, where respondents connect their financial well-being to their emotional well-being in reports of worry or concerns about the present and the future, their own future and their children's future. General worry and concern stem from the link between financial and emotional well-being, which are greater when anticipating the children's future. So in other words, it's not your own financial stress, it's your worry on behalf of the next generation that creates a stress. And I just want to mention, and parenthetically, that sometimes that was not only about their offspring, it was about children in general in the future. Which was a kind of altruistic concern. I'm worried that children won't have it in future, all children won't have it as good as we did. That kind of anxiety came through. So discussion continuing, policy discussions about aging in Canada might attend to the link between perceived financial stress and well-being, which generally they don't at present, although there is some concern in that direction. Strong evidence exists that income security challenges of some in later life, or as they anticipate later life, but less is known about those in midlife. It's almost as if the people in midlife have kind of dropped off the radar. There's some studies of older people and of younger people, but midlife people who are moving through their life course and will be the older adults of tomorrow are not studied as much as they might be. It seems like they carry financial stresses into their later years. I always think of them as like turtles. You carry the financial stress, you walk through with it on your back, and you don't know the effects of it. And they are transmitting it to their children. Attention only to income security with aging is insufficient, although extremely important, so I'm not denying that. But there may be a need to focus on how financial stress from mid to later life links with health and well-being. Policy attention may be needed beyond income supports to health issues connected to financial stress over the life course. So what are some strengths and limitations of this work? Well, clearly, a strength is a relatively large cohort, the largest population-based cohorts we could get in Canada, and of course that has limitations. Long window of observations for a decade following the same people. The qualitative interviews, we argue, add further insights, and we capture changes over time in financial stress with two measures of health. And it could be argued that both are inadequate, but nonetheless, that's what we had. Limitations, not a perfect measure of financial stress. If I were, had a magic wand, which I do in my office, but it doesn't seem to work, so I have to get it powered up. But if I had a magic wand, I'd have a different definition of financial stress. But it would be hard because you'd have to include a great deal about what those anxieties might include. And of course, then there's the usual problem of attrition with any longitudinal study and missing data, which we assume are random, but usually aren't, but we got to assume something, so off we go. And self-reported health is subject to bias, that's clear. I mean, we know that on any given day, I mean, ask yourself, any given day, gee, I feel good today. Tomorrow I get a cold, I don't feel so good. Or the weather changes, and so your health is reported less well than it was the day before. So that's a problem. And the qualitative interviews were not longitudinal. Nonetheless, they gave us a pretty interesting picture. So possible next steps. We need to understand, in our view, more about the duration of effects of perceived financial strain. How does it really work over time, and what are the long-term consequences? We only have 10 years. In particular, the effects of sharp economic declines, such as the Great Recession of 2008 plus, which affected some people greatly and is still affecting some people greatly. We need to know that, the shock and how the shock differentially affected people in different categories, socioeconomic categories, other kinds of categories, but also people under different levels of perceived financial strain, and how financial strain may differentially affect those in different socioeconomic groups and at different stages of their life course. So if you've got young children, it might matter differently than if you have children just about ready to enter university. You're just about ready to retire and you were affected because your pension was affected. You know, the intersection of your biography and what these perturbations are in terms of systemic shocks matters hugely, and we really don't know exactly how that works. In terms of welfare state policy, it would be fascinating to find out what the effect of guaranteed annual income, which is being actively discussed in Canada, might be on well-being with aging. And that could be an experimental design looking at that, because it might undermine this business of perceived financial stress to some extent. There are other studies that have shown that the guaranteed annual income proposal would take the heat off of a lot of government programs, but it would be interesting to look at. So here's anti-acid. In concluding, I'm going to retire and live off my savings. What I'll do in the second week, I have no idea. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.